So let's talk about collecting an army of Egyptian-style Space Marine sorcerers and their arcane rubric automata. Time for a few thoughts on schemes as to collecting Thousand Suns in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Thousand Suns, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of collecting the faction in Warhammer 40k, the appeal of the army and why you might want to collect Thousand Suns in the first place, with some of the pros and cons of them, some ideas for planning out a force and scrying into the future of your collection, some of the best options for starting an army in terms of model purchases, and then expanding from there, and talking briefly about the rules with one example army list at the end. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. In Warhammer 40k, the Thousand Suns are the Sorcerer Space Marine Legion of Tzeentch, the Chaos God of magic, trickery and scheming. Falling into the clutches of the Changers of Ways during the Horus Heresy, the Thousand Suns Sorcerers experimenting with forbidden magics during the Horus Heresy, and were ultimately driven onto the side of Chaos when the Space Wolves and Adeptus Custodes burnt down Prospero, the Thousand Suns homeworld, in theory for Magnus disrupting the Webway project of the Emperor, though the machinations of the traitor legions helped manipulate them into doing so. After that point though, their Primarch Magnus the Red dedicated himself to sorcery and Tzeentch the Changer of Ways, as now perhaps the greatest sorcerer in the galaxy, his legion and attendant sorcerers dedicated to destroying the Emperor and the Imperium with their endless thirst for vengeance. The boons of Tzeentch were maybe more of a curse than a blessing though for the Legion's rank and file, ever-changing mutations devolving the Space Marines in the Legion, up to the point where the Sorcerer Ahriman enacts a great rubric, the spell reducing all the Legion Space Marines besides the Sorcerers to dust sealed within their armour, and now they're silent clanking Space Marines, doing the bidding of the Sorcerers, fighting with bolt guns and warp flamers to purge the foe in magical fire. In current 40k, Thousand Suns tend to make war as scheming cabals of sorcerers, commanding their legion to great victories for Tzeentch, always with a great plot or ritual to try and enact, and alongside these silent phalanxes of rubrics, flocks of twisted mutants are often thrown into the battle as expendable troops, and ancient robots might walk alongside them. Appearance and theming wise, they go for a bit of an Egyptian-style army, and they gain lots of attention after their prominent appearance in Space Marine 2 rather recently, having made this particular Chaos Legion a lot more well known. Miniatures wise, the Thousand Suns have a kind of small to medium sized model range depending on exactly what you count for it. Most of their actual unique miniatures are at least somewhat recent, usually hailing from around about 2016 or later, though I would say that the actual core of their force, with the actual rubric marines, sorcerers and dedicated Thousand Suns things, do have a pretty tiny list of units. In addition to that, their codex is expanded with 3 other sections, a bunch of generic Chaos Space Marine things, certain demon engines like Forge Fiends, generic transports like Rhinos and Land Raiders and things. Their Zangor units with the sort of mutant birdmen cultists that attend them. They were ported in from Age of Sigmar, so are kind of as much fantasy miniatures as they are 40k. And then they've got these Tzeentch demon units, which they can field in their one allied detachment. In general though, I'd rate the vast majority of their core range as really quite cool looking miniatures. Their Sorcerer's Egyptian Space Marine style look is really quite a fun one in my opinion. As ever with a lot of the Chaos Marine models though, they're really quite busy miniatures with quite a lot of trim, and it can take some time to paint them up. Going through their core range, and some of their most iconic models are the Rubric style units, the Scarab Occult Terminators and the standard Rubric Marines, either hefty Terminators equipped for a mix of melee and shooting, or more standard style Bolter Marines armed with Warp Flamers or Inferno Bolt Guns, both units led into battle by Psychers to oversee them. There's the Primarch himself of course, Magnus the Red, a rather twisted and avian Primarch Sorcerer of Tzeentch. It's a pretty spectacular demon centerpiece to the army, and then there's a few sorcerers, some generic exalted sorcerers, and then Ahriman himself, borne aloft on his Disc of Tzeentch. For their more recent miniatures, in 9th and 10th edition their releases were an Infernal Master character, as a variant sort of sorcerer with a cool conjuring screamers sort of look, and in 10th edition they've had their Sekitar robots, basically a hybrid of Egyptian statues and ancient automata. I feel like they maybe had some more mixed reception. Some people really don't like the look of them, some think they're nice enough, and I feel like they do have some quite cool lore, being sort of statues lying in wait for enemies to encroach upon the Thousand Suns arcane ruins and things that they're guarding. For their Zangor units, they're basically humans that have been mutated by Tzeentch into a sort of goat-bird type thing. As mentioned, these ones were kind of directly ported from Age of Sigmar. There is an upgrade sprue for them with some auto pistols and chainswords, though they do look kind of fantasy in appearance. There's enlightened elite ones that can be fielded on discs of Tzeentch, and also the all very weird and disturbing Mutalith Vortex Beast, a great big warp energy beacon that can walk into battle alongside. They can field plenty of the generic Chaos Space Marine kit as well, such as fire support from Predator Annihilators or demon engines such as the Defiler. In the past though, they really haven't typically tended to be the mainstay of the army. Generally for in-game emphasis, the powers almost always tended to be revolving around the combos with Psychers and their rubrics, as opposed to buffing tanks and vehicles for most of the time. Pricing wise, I'd say it's generally good news for the Thousand Sons. They are kind of notably cheaper to collect than the vast majority of Warhammer 40k, particularly if focusing on their rubrics and sorcerers. In particular, maybe their three most central kits, the Rubric Marines, Scarab Occult Terminators, and Exalted Sorcerers, are all fairly elite and come with a helpful amount of models in the box, more so than maybe some more recent 40k armies with releases, and it means that all of them get a fair chunk of points on the board per the amount of money spent. They also have a handy combat patrol that doesn't overlap too much with those, which if anything is maybe a positive thing, as that can be another pretty reasonable option to expand. On top of that, while they might have a smallish unit roster, it does mean that you can collect the vast majority of the options in your codex to have them available to field fairly easily. With only say 5 or 6 mainline infantry style units, it's not too hard to have one each of those, compared with the ridiculous number of options that certain armies like Space Marines have. Gameplay wise, the Thousand Sons have maybe had a bit of a reputation for being a slightly more tricky army to play. Obviously rule sets can vary edition to edition, but compared with the average army of Warhammer 40k, they've often had some slightly more complex rules to grasp than the average one. It's not necessarily that they're super hard to play just on a standard basis, but maybe get right and get the decisions right that you need to might take a little bit more thought. I don't think that's really changed with the new codex either, and the Cabal of Sorcerers special rule. They basically have some really powerful buffing spells that they can do. Things like double moves, big damage, or big debuffs. They can all be at least somewhat unreliable to cast, and depending on how you plan out your turn, you could do some very different things with them, particularly coordinating between movement and things that you want to shoot afterwards. So as well as playing the standard game of 40k in an intelligent way, you have to master that mechanic and any detachment rules to get the most out of your army. Aside from that, for their general overall feel for gameplay, they might often most classically play as a battle line of rubric units, backed up with heavy use of characters and sorcerers, and typically their core combos often revolve around the Rubric Marine shooting, backed up by Sorceress Witchfire from their sorcerers, and then big damage combos with stacking buffs from detachment rules and their psychic mechanics. Then to support that battle line, different things have been good in the past, maybe Magnus as a great big centerpiece, maybe some armoured support for a bit of dedicated anti-tank at long range, and usually in 10th edition a good amount of chaff units, with things like Zangors skirmishing over the objectives and being a bit more expendable than your core units. They can be a little bit slow to move around the board outside of their double movement style thing, and if you go really heavy on the sorcerers, then overall they might not be the most durable army in the world as well. As a result, maybe could be just a touch more punishing on the mistakes. Power-wise, it's certainly early days at the moment after the codex, and first impressions to me, it feels like they're solidly strong but not crazily overpowered at first impressions. There's definitely some interesting stuff in the book, and I'll be looking forward to seeing how well they do at tournaments when they hit those in earnest. Either way though, I wouldn't really be focusing on current power as a reason to collect an army or not. It changes all the time, and particularly in current 40k with regular balance updates, so there's a pretty reasonable chance if they're either over or underpowered, they won't be that way for all that long. In any case, if you want to collect an army of Zinchian Egyptian space wizards, commanding mutants and psychic to dominate the battlefield and further their schemes, the Thousand Sons might well be for you. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA. They made some fancy custom merch dice for the channel in the past and asked to sponsor a few videos with their dice designs. The general idea behind their offerings is they've got loads of different designs of dice, many of which could apply to various different armies and tabletop wargaming factions out there. There's certainly a few like this Infinity Dragon or Cult of Knowledge design that could be relevant enough to the Legions of Tzeentch. They've got loads more designs though. In general, I vouch for them being good quality. They feel nice in the hand and roll well. There's the choice of either squared or rounded corners like these ones here. They do have a pretty massive range of designs for all sorts of other armies too, and potentially could be a nice enough gift for a player dedicated to an army. Their usual pricing tends to be around about $32 or £29 for 25 dice. If you use the code Auspex, then you get 5% off any order, so do that if you pick anything up. There's also the channel merch dice designs as well. You can check those out, links down below. And in any case, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring the video. If you do decide to go down the route of collecting a Thousand Sons army, then there's a few things that you could think about for preparing a force. If you wanted to seek out a bit more info and general knowledge on the faction, getting the codex itself isn't the worst start in the world. It's got the unit profiles and rules from Games Workshop, plus plenty of miniature galleries and the lore sections. As ever with all the Chaos Legions as well, there's absolutely loads of stuff in the Horus Heresy novels, plenty of stuff going into detail as to how the Thousand Sons became what they are in the 41st millennium. For messing around with rules and list building, there's New Recruit and Warhapedia. They're third-party creations, and Games Workshop's app if you happen to have a codex. That can be pretty good for rules referencing. If you want to try before you buy a bit, you could have a go at Tabletop Simulator or Proxy and Models to try them out. And if seeking a fair bit more knowledge, there's loads here on YouTube. I've made a Thousand Sons codex overview, and hopefully there'll be a bit more to come, covering their army lists and a tier list in the not too distant future. There's masses of other stuff out there for the Thousand Sons though, battle reports, painting guides and lore. Just giving a search can give a whole load of stuff. It's generally well worth it to follow along with social media as well, either joining Thousand Sons Discord servers, Facebook pages or subreddits depending on where you get your social media. They can be reasonable enough places to get a little bit of an insight as to what other hobbyists are thinking and talking about, and also be a place to ask a few questions to already experienced generals. I think early on when collecting a force it could be a good idea to put a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point list together, just so you have some idea as to what you might wind up with or what you want in a 2,000 point army and the steps that you need to take to get there. In general, for the Thousand Sons, people generally tend to collect at least a fairly balanced mix of the army, usually with the core of their collection being the Rubric Marines, Scarab Occult and Sorcerers, and a balanced mix of the other support units to flesh out their force. There's definitely plenty of ways that you could skew a Thousand Sons army to various different themes though. How much use would you like to get out of Zangors and mutant units in your armies? Do you want them to be a big theme or a supporting element, or just completely absent? You could go down heavier use of demon engines, and both the Zangors and the demon engine style ones have got some good detachments to support them. And you could add allied demons into the force. The Games Workshop have made that into a bit of a weird situation at the moment, where there's just the one detachment that supports them, and if you take that one, then you've got to go kind of heavy on the units to make it work, and it feels like a bit more of a risky way to collect Thousand Sons at the moment in my opinion. You could build around one of those detachments, or you could go completely narrative driven and build your force around one of the great cults of lore. There's plenty of them that are at least somewhat fleshed out with their own themes and backstories, or maybe represent an army commanded just by one charismatic sorcerer, and have your forces represent fielding his warband in battle. I'll talk a little bit more about the detachments later, but the ones from the Thousand Sons army are the Grand Coven, which is the index style balanced and magic and sorcery focused, the Warp Meld Pact, which focuses on their mutant Zangor units, the Rubric Phalanx, which have the Rubrics and the Scarab Occult Terminators front and centre, the Change Host of Deceit, which has some various tricksy things that the allied demons can do, horrors and flamers and screamers surviving more than normal. And then there's the Warp Forged Cabal, which can have sorcerers having some big buffing support for their vehicle units, potentially with a bunch of damage rerolls and some other support. In general though, you can field any combination of Thousand Sons units in each of these detachments. It's just the demons that are locked to the Change Host detachment. It's just more that some detachments support certain units a lot better than others. Finally, for other things to plan when starting an army, working out your paint scheme is another big one. I feel like the best place to start with this one is almost certainly a Rubric Marine. They're the standard trooper of the army and have a lot of elements that are present on the other models, and they're a little bit lower investment compared with the rest of the stuff out there. So you can try out a scheme and decide whether or not it works for you, and it won't be the biggest deal in the world if you have to redo. As mentioned, they really are quite busy and detailed miniatures. Some people like to spray in the trim colour and then block in the armour panels. Some prefer the other way around, but if you want to paint them in different colours, as I think does look quite good, generally they can be a more time consuming army to paint than some. There's plenty of good painting guides out there, both here on YouTube and elsewhere. Games Workshop have made a good few of their own as well. And the vast majority of people do generally tend to paint them in their box art blue and yellow style colour scheme with the gold trim. Though it's definitely not mandatory. You could have a different colour scheme to represent a splinter force under the command of one sorcerer, or even go for their Heresy era scheme in red. Games Workshop do have a bunch of official colour schemes out there as well, some of them having greater or lesser variations on the more standard one. You can execute their sort of blue and yellow in really quite a lot of different ways, emphasising different tones, or going for something completely different, like those Crimson Suns ones here, or maybe a force allied to Abaddon and taking some Black Legion heraldry. Planning and painting things aside though, let's talk about the actual model kits for getting a miniature force on the tabletop. I feel like for the vast majority of armies out there in Warhammer 40K, I usually recommend their Combat Patrol box set as the first place to start, though honestly for Thousand Sons I feel like I probably wouldn't start there. I see the Combat Patrol box set as a purchase I would make, but maybe as an expansion option, and instead start with one each of the Exalted Sorcerers kit, the Scarab Occult Terminators and the Rubric Marines. Nothing wrong with starting with the Combat Patrol though, if you did just want one big box to jump in, and at the moment the Warp Flame Thrallband Battle Force launch box that they've had for 10th edition is another good choice. If you can find that, I would generally rate it as a good deal if you can find it at the price it's supposed to be, and that does contain the Rubric Scarabs and Exalted Sorcerers, plus some Sekitar robots, and I feel like it's a well balanced box. To take a closer look at those kits I'd start with though, if you bought those it'd be these three. Prices from Games Workshop are around about £120 or $187, so it will be a little bit more expensive than a Combat Patrol box set, but it would give you a good chunk of points on the board, around about 600 points or so. even if ideally at some point down the line you might want to get more units for those sorcerers to lead. To give you a core of the force of the units that most people get into Thousand Sons to collect, the sorcerers are your generic leaders. They've almost always been very relevant units to put in an army. The Rubric Marines often pair with them to be the core damage dealers for the force, with big buffed shooting with their rituals, and the Scarab Occult Terminators have maybe been a little bit more unreliably good. Sometimes they're absolutely excellent as massive big hitting central damage dealers, sometimes costing a bit more than they really should do in points, but either way they've got a pretty cool aesthetic in my opinion, and they're at least a fairly easy unit to use, a fair bit of threat in range and melee and some good defense, so not really too hard to get value out of for beginner more casual games. Otherwise, perhaps the other big option for jumping into Thousand Sons, I guess, would be that Combat Patrol. In this one you get the generic Chaos Demon Prince kit, one unit of Rubric Marines, a squad of Zangor Enlightened, the elite ones on the discs, and a Zangor Shaman. Combat Patrol boxes typically cost £100 or $170 at time of recording, and compared with buying separately, this one has around about a discount of 30% or so quite a good deal compared with buying the kits individually, presuming of course that you wanted everything in the box. For the points included, it's around about 470 points, so fairly good numbers from that point of view. In game, pretty much most of the units are usable enough. I'd probably fill the Demon Prince with wings at the moment. The Enlightened are seriously nasty with their great bows, a really good chaff unit. The Zangor Shaman is one of the cheapest ways to cast spells, and the Rubrics have some good damage combos. For the most part, I'd still probably be more tempted to go with Warp Flamers. They've got a seriously punchy damage combo in the Rubric Phalanx with some big Warp Bolter shooting. It does feel to me more like an expansion set though, given that there's only one of the more core Thousand Sons central units here. I feel like this one plus the previous three though is a really good solid start to an army. As ever when starting new armies, it's worth bearing in mind the various different places to buy Warhammer 40k miniatures. Direct from Games Workshop is generally the most reliable, but also usually the most expensive. The majority of collectors around the world generally tend to buy things from discount retailers, usually offering somewhere between 10 and 20% off depending on where you live around the world. For a few examples, there's some linked down in the video description. Element Games for 15% off, and I've got a bunch of other ones linked in the link tree next door to it. For Australia, there's Gap Games at a big 21% off. For Canada, there's Fenris Workshop for 10% off. In the USA, there's Wargame Portal for 15%. And in Germany and the EU, there's Taschengelddieb at 16% off. These specific ones linked down in the video description help to support the channel. If you happen to buy anything after clicking the links, it doesn't cost any more to do so though. A massive thanks to anyone using those ones when they pick up some Warhammer models, it does help out. Though of course there's loads of other good ones available out there. New plastic kits from discount retailers aren't the only place that you can get models though. The second-hand market can be well worth a look. It might depend on your local scene and country, but if you live in a place with a good reseller market, it can often be a pathway to saving really quite a lot of money and potentially a good amount of time as well. Quality can be variable of course, and certainly more recently there's been an explosion of 3D printing and third-party manufacturers making sculpts. Most of the Warhammer 40k armies have things that people have tried to make sort of near equivalents of. You can give those a search if you'd like. Can be fun for upgrades and things to add a bit of aesthetic flavour, maybe in particular to some more generic Chaos style things, though plenty of full Sorcerers miniatures are out there too. In any case, moving on beyond the kits already talked about for other options to expand the army. Infernal Masters can be nice enough for some powerful psychic shooting. They can work quite well jumping out of rhinos that can buff their damage. They're quite a fun miniature as well in my opinion, one of the more recent ones from the 9th edition release. I think most Thousand Sons players will typically want to eventually pick up their Primarch, probably not one to go for absolutely straight away unless you really want to paint up the model super fast. He's had a pretty good track record of being solidly usable in 10th edition, a massive psychic linchpin at the heart of the army. A unit or two of Zangors can be some pretty great support. They can scout into the midboard to claim some objectives, and are a pretty great expendable chaff unit. The Mutalith Vortex Beast has some nice general purpose firepower, has some nice synergy things with the Cabal of Sorcerers, and also a scary lance attack that can throw out big damage to enemy tanks and monsters all the way out to 36 inches now. The new Sekitar robots are the release for 10th edition. They're the Thousand Sons Infiltrator choice, and that usually gives them a good chance of being pretty usable. They've got some free Overwatch which could punish enemies advancing on their position as well. They are unusually fighty for Infiltrators too, and perhaps to cart some Rubric Marines across the battlefield, a Chaos Rhino could be a good idea. A squad of these with some Psyker support, disembarking and hitting something from the midboard can hit very hard indeed. Rhinos can buff psychic weapons and make them far more deadly when they're targeting something. Finally, for limited or past Battle Force box sets, the launch box set for the Thousand Sons for 10th edition was this Warp Flame Thrallband. The original price I believe was around £130 or $210, maybe around about €170 I want to say. And this one had some Rubrics, Scarabs, Exalted Sorcerers, and then 2 sets of the Sekitar robots. In my opinion, really quite a good mix of units at around about 30% off or so. If you can find that at some sort of approximation of its original price, it could be a pretty solid option for jumping in. You might find some at some brick and mortar Games Workshop stores or discount retailers. They did sell out at least kind of quickly in the UK and USA, though seem there were a fair few more in Australia. The previous Combat Patrol box set could be another reasonable option to expand. Again, if you can find it, it's no longer on sale from Games Workshop, though given that they weren't super popular at the time, there's a reasonable chance that some discount retailers might have them in stock collecting dust. This one again very much feels like an expansion box, an Infernal Master, some Scarab Occult Terminators and 20 Zangors. Again, it might depend on just how much focus you want on the Goat Birdmen, but I think it's pretty reasonable to have 20 chaff models to act in support for your main legion. There are other pass kits as well. The Boarding Patrol for the Thousand Suns that wasn't around too long and came out towards the tail end of 9th edition, and then the Court of the Crimson King, a big box with Magnus in it. That was a Christmas Battle Force box set and probably quite hard to find now. Again, I just work out whether or not you're getting an actual good deal on them when you pick them up. If you're not actually saving any significant money versus a discount retailer, you may as well just get the exact kits that you want and not try and seek out a deal that isn't really a deal. Just in general, when collecting and expanding an army for Warhammer 40k though, there's always a good amount of scope for just collecting what you like the look of. 40k rules change over time with balance updates, and at least at time of recording it feels like most units in the army are really quite usable, and certainly either in a more casual setting or combined with a core of the list that is quite scary and well put together. I generally aim to build up a balanced core of the army that you can play some small games with, and then gradually expand with small chunks of units, getting them painted up and ready to play as you go. Maybe it's just a very rough overall goal. If building towards an army of something like 2,000 to 3,000 points or so, I'll probably start with that combo I mentioned of those 3 kits plus the Combat Patrol box set, and then maybe next expansions after that being some Zangors and Magnus. That'll give you a pretty good core for the army for some small to medium sized games, and then maybe some very rough sort of ideas, gradually build up to maybe around about 20 to 30 Rubric Marines total, 20 Zangors, 10 Scarab Occult Terminators, and maybe 6 each of the Secateurs and Zangor Enlightened. I'd quite like to be able to field an Infernal Master or 2 plus Ahriman. You could maybe use these sorcerers just as stand-in Infernal Masters if you wanted. Other units I'd be a bit more tempted to prioritise would maybe be something like 1 to 2 units of Rhinos, Mutalith Beasts and Spawn, but just more generally any units that you find fun in appearance and want to paint up, or effective in game and you think they could help you out a fair bit and see a lot of practical time on the tabletop. In general though, my focus will be kept on their unique stuff. There's just more chance of Games Workshop bothering to balance their sorcerers, rubric units and Magnus versus say things like their Predator tanks or Helldrake. Not that they couldn't get good, I feel like it's just less likely compared with their core things. I generally have a rough 2,000 point army list to work towards gradually, playing games and adapting as you go, and trying to strike the balance where you've actually painted up new stuff before buying new things, at least once you've got enough miniatures to play some games. Talking of games for fielding forces on the tabletop, it's worth mentioning where the rules are. Codex Thousand Suns is the main rules source for the army, and if you buy one of these, then you can access the same rules via the Warhammer 40k app as you get an unlock code for the codex content. Otherwise, currently in 40k, physical codexes are supported by a bunch of rules downloads from the Warhammer community website. Perhaps most importantly are current points from the Munitor and Field Manual, which is under core documents in the 40k download section. The codex will get an errata document as well for any mistakes or misprints they might have made, and the balanced data slate might make a few changes to rules if Games Workshop deem it necessary. Also there is the Hexwarp Thrallband detachment. That's another detachment with rules that you can play based on Zones of Control and Sorcerer's Might. It's under the Grotma section in the Warhammer downloads thing, though unfortunately it's not really all that strong compared with some of the ones in the codex. Several third-party sites tend to host rules as well, Warhapedia or New Recruits, both being places that you can mess around with rules points and army lists. For a rough overview of their rules and fields though, their main army rule is Cabal of Sorcerers, the idea being that your Psycho models with the rule can cast on 2d6 and potentially risk an extra third at the chance of taking some perils of the warp damage, and if they're successful as per the warp charge and the higher casting value, they can get some seriously powerful effects in game. There's 2 of them that buff shooting, and between the 2 they can be just seriously savage firepower. Rerolling all hit rolls is an option with Destiny's Ruin if you cast it on a 10+. Twist of Fate can add extra AP to shooting units, 1 AP on the lower casting value or 2 AP on the higher, which is pretty mad. Temporal Surge is a really important one as well. It can allow you to double move your units around the board, either a d6 inches or a 6-inch normal move, and getting that kind of extra movement before still being able to shoot and charge is really massive, particularly as several units move kind of slowly. And then finally there's Doombolt, where if you can cast it on an 11 or more, then you get d3+3 mortal wounds on your targets, a nice focal infusion of damage to overwhelm one area of the board that you most need to. I feel like it's a pretty interesting mechanic, and you need to weigh up the risk between psykers failing their attacks and the damage that you might take if you're casting on 3d6, and maybe building a bit of redundancy with multiple casters able to help each other out when some inevitably fail. For the detachments, I feel like literally all of them have some interest, at least for casual play. So maybe at first impressions either the Grand Coven for the psychic damage focused one, or perhaps the Rubrique Phalanx focused on the automata could be some of the most interesting. You can certainly get some very dangerous psychic bolters in the second one. The Grand Coven seems hard to go too far wrong with. Buffs to psychic damage as the core rule with Kindred Sorcery, giving you extra range, a +1 to the wound roll, or devastating wounds, each for one turn within a battle. The 2 damage buff ones are pretty nice. For stratagems, the reducing a damage result to 0 for a single failed save is a pretty guaranteed return on value, and otherwise you can sticky objectives, swap around detachment rules, 2 different ones, reroll a psychic test, which is a big deal, particularly if it could be absolutely game changing to get something cast on the higher value. And there's the big 2 command point one for +9" extra range and rerolls to hit and wound for your psychic weapons. That could be rather murderous with Magnus's sorcery in particular. The enhancements all seem pretty nice as well. An extra Doom Bolt once per game, teleporting the bearer's unit once per game, which could be quite nice to threaten enemy home field objectives later on, and a +1 strength and damage to psychic weapons could work really nicely for most of the sorcerers, though it tends to be good on Infernal Masters. Here's just one example of maybe a fairly well balanced Thousand Sons list that emphasises building around the launch battle force and adding a combat patrol box set, and then some other supporting units beyond that, just for a rough idea of what a 2,000 point army could look like. Leading the force we've got Magnus the Red with his fast movement, big damage and powerful spell casting, and to back him up we've also got a Winged Demon Prince for some fast moving threats, and then to lead a whole bunch of Rubric Marines we've got 2 regular sorcerers and an Infernal Master. I've chosen to equip the Rubric Marines with Warp Flamers and a Soul Reaper cannon in each, and the 2 smaller squads with characters will be jumping out of a Rhino to amp up their psychic damage. Then there's 2 small squads of Zangor Enlightened with great bows. They're fast and expendable outriders that can be sacrificed for objectives, though have perhaps surprisingly dangerous shooting for that role. There's 2 units of 10 Zangors to scout up and take the midfield. The unit of Scarab Occult Terminators that comes in the big box, which can maybe drop down as a rapid ingress style threat. 2 units of 2 Sekitar robots with claws and the heavy warp flamers to infiltrate and secure the midboard, and could be quite nice for free Overwatch. And finally a Mutalith Vortex Beast to help with nearby spell casting, and also have a big dangerous lance shot that might well be able to one-shot a vehicle if you're lucky. Between all that, the Rubric Marines and Magnus should be able to put out some pretty serious damage output. There's plenty of other sort of mid-threat units in the Sekitar's Mutalith and the Scarab Occult, and a fair few objective grabbing units with the Zangor units to go around scoring points. Hopefully that should be at least a somewhat balanced list with a bunch of fun stuff that also isn't a pushover. I'll leave that one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts as to collecting a Thousand Sons army down in the comments below. I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas down in the comments. If you'd like something else Thousand Sons to watch, then feel free to check out my Codex review video. I'll leave that linked in the video description. A big thank you to Barra of Dice for sponsoring this one. As mentioned, they're a high quality dice maker based in the USA. A big range of dice, some of which might be appropriate enough for the Sorcerers of Tzeentch. They've got a massive range of things though. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and I've got that Auspex code for 5% off if you do want to pick something up. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly aim to keep the regular videos coming with new ones out just about every day. I'm sure there'll be some more things for the Thousand Sons with tier lists and army list roundups. If you'd like to support the channel, then check out those affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description if you're looking to pick up any Thousand Sons models. And Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well if you'd like to support there. A big thank you to anyone helping out. It is the main thing that supports the video creation on the channel. In any case though, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.